As usual, I'm interested in pointing out having learned too much about how a sociological experiment, um, the best people equipped to assist in these sorts of expeditions would be faithful, religious believers, and they could convince you that me having this heart-shaped squidgy on my table is proof that I'm thinking of committing cannibalism, but they could think of whatever, or they could say it's proof that I need to exercise more. I make fun of this idea when I say that the owners of Capital Chemists will tell you that the Mona Lisa is proof that while being hung and framed, she was desperately in need of antipsychotic medication from the Capital Chemist group, for which they could claim a rebate, a health insurance commission rebate of $1,000 per monthly supply. So the nuances between when you're thinking of degrees of meditation, premeditative offenses is, and that's what I think courtrooms take into consideration as well. How possibly premeditated can this have been, And horridly so in the case of Gary Cans and Mr. Cans and Mr. Tall, for what they are doing. Horridly premeditative. If they're keeping their theology secret, I've talked also about the ludicrous nature of the idea that you can join our church if you prove that your whole heart is invested in it before you are taught a single lesson. That means things like no information is questioned, or that the questioning of information that's taught is equivalent to a heart-filled betrayal of the institution. So non-compliance, any feelings of non-compliance are instantaneously taboo at the nicest. Their standpoint on Jesus being a martyr, and a martyr being a person who gives up without a fight, is one that doesn't take into consideration ransom money posted for his kidnap. So funnily enough, they are orchestrating these, this person is in a psychotic state, send cops around, have the cops take them against their will, have the cops say they're just doing their job. They'll put up money to say that a person they've picked has gone to certain locations, like frequents strip clubs or things like that. So the various elements, Jesus seems indeed to be their template for martyring and for picking out martyrs. The other flaw with that conversationally is that, and in my case, they had been going through online discussions and debates on online forums, and deduced or precluded that the content of discussion on these forums was representative of my teachings and ideas for which I would solicit recruiting members, and then teach them and make them trust in me and believe in, and thus could be called the cause for which I was to be martyred. So they actually see that as you having a psychotic, but the problem is the question: how do you know this person was being an educator? In relation to these texts here and these texts here, why were they being an educator? And where I think this problem comes about in their minds is that because their church is centuries older than the last 200 years worth of academic scholarship on the Gospels of the New Testament, which have concluded Mark's was written first, and that the authors of Matthew and Luke both had copies of Mark that they copied off and then added to. You can see the miracle stories, and you can see the miracle stories in paganism 1,500 years before Jesus' birth. Is that in the Freemason churches is martyring Jesus as the conglomerate of all four of the Gospels, and it's not only impossible to do. There's just so many contradictions and absurdities, including that of his last words. His saying, my father, why have thou forsaken me?" is the opposite of him saying, "Father, into thy hands I commit or place my spirit." So if they even think they can make a case against that, it's an absurd case that contradicts itself, and they contradict themselves. So the byproduct of that is that they'll be targeting people who aren't even martyrs at all, and aren't even religious at all. There are a couple of repressed homosexuals that repressed homosexuals to the point of being predatorial towards other citizens, even after agreeing, even if you worked for them and they had made an agreement not to contact you at your residence outside of work hours, they still will. Contact you saying you've got a beautiful mind. I'm like, fuck. Even if you're saying that, fuck off. Like, until you go all the way back to the things you've said to me and work that out, and go all the way back to the things you've said to me during work hours, and send me footage of you pleasuring a sheep, I don't want you contacting me at my house even to say you think I have a beautiful mind. And you'd agreed to back off and not contact me outside of employment hours. So, yeah, and they've got these lunatic views about, with their studying about what constitutes a citizen's reaching to them. You can be verbally silent, not speaking to anybody, and they will think that, preclude that your thought. You could even be going back home from work, thinking about wanting to argue with or smash one of the employees' faces in for the way that you were spoken to during your work shift, and they'll still think it was a reach out to them out of repressed homoerotic affection. So I think they've invented their own pyramid scheme of idiocy between the definitions of a homosexual male, their theocracy involving God and Lucifer, their secrecy, and a superiority complex. Now, so to go back to the beginning and why misunderstandings. So I look back now and understand why some misunderstandings were a blind spot to us both. Is then the frequency at which, like a pharmacist saying, showing off an insurance card. I'm insured up for $1 million in case I kill a patient, and occurrences of references to kill were greater made to me and me isolated from another staff member than they were in front of another staff member or another employer. Now, there's also the element of when they tell you before they employ you that they have to run a police check on you, and they were shady about that. And I realized why, because once they explain what, even just discussing the process of their police check and what it entailed, was going to tell me that they were actually police endorsed or part of the police or a direct affiliates of the AFP, or not. So, yeah. And what they had checked, it turned out, I would learn years later, was this newspaper article on the conflict between my parents in 1989. They had checked that newspaper, and that was what they had looked into. So, and yeah, they had checked it, and while assuming I was present in the house. So make them doing that and making those assumptions, and then talking to me at work was really no different to the worst of being picked on in school in terms of how they talk. That one reason I don't like gossip is because I know a lot about what the talk around it mind fuck does. It takes up too much of your time. There can be a thing in relation to your person that's a bunch of ideas that a bunch of people could have good motives to talk around it, could have fear and be afraid, so they talk around it. They could think that you are too stupid to figure that they're thinking about you in a particular way, so they talk around it, and it leaves you playing guessing games as to what it is that they're thinking about and talking about. And that I could tell even I think is harmful to the eardrums. So as if it's putting a stretchful strain on them, and you're calmed by. I would fall asleep. I would fall asleep listening to bands like Slipknot and really heavy music, and so not only that, but the sense that a person should yeah, well, I mean, a lot of so there was not one person between school, and it had me thrown because when they teach about genetics, they do bring out textbooks where they say, well, these two identical twins separated from birth and had no point of contact with one another, and then when they were eventually when they were eventually reintroduced or introduced to one another, it was found that they were smoking the same brand and strength of cigarette. It was found they had all these similarities. So, okay, well, that's identical twins. Yeah, but I don't find I don't find or feel that it's promoting responsibility at all. And there are locum pharmacists that if Gary Cans even tried to look them in the eye, they would just say, get fucked. Like, the equivalent of get fucked. I cannot stand to be in your presence. And, so, yeah, religious scientists are existentially moronic and more capable of error because I look at it as, for every being in your head that you think exists that doesn't exist, there's an existing being who does exist, whose existence you could compromise. Just from that. And then, of course, you address the same being in your head to make you feel better about it all. You tell yourself that being in your head is looking after the persons that you harmed, the real people. Each one of their lives is more important and valuable than your entire God's existence. So yeah, the religion gives in what would, if all sides weighed up, get described as neurochemical warfare. Studying something while affecting it, while damaging it, and omitting the harm done by the study process. The National Academy of Sciences would recognize this. Particle physics professors would recognize this. So who excuses it? The religious. Who even precludes that their initially gathered or gained so-called results are accurate? The religious, or the religious impersonating law enforcement. For instance, it's not always appropriate to reduce all the stimuli or all the activity that goes on in a person's mind to the scrutiny of an interrogative, is this true or false? Lines of interrogative questioning. Because not without direct epistemological contest of the exclusion of the imagination, which then washes out in reports that do get passed on to government agencies to say that person such and such is delusional or suffering from visual delusions. So looked at a certain way, you could review them as projectiles. Projection, it's interesting to read about the concept. It's a lot of it is done, and it's how you work out. And I'm prepared to, I am and have been prepared to work with and for religious people. I just don't want their. I find the majority of them, who are the ones I like, if they're prepared to engage me in a discussion where I see that they prove that differing points of view don't phase them, to oppose a friendship, is where I would draw the line of and say, yeah, cool. Um, Jim Jeffries does it well in a stand-up. He goes, uh, of course I respect your right to be religious, but please know that you're wrong. Um, Cause yeah, how would they like it if they cop the same type of treatment? The Earth came from a giant rabbit's stool, and uh, Earth aren't impressed with being a giant shit, and growing off a giant shit. So uh, all these other religions have been thrust ahead of this story, but it's trickling through in Easter, and there are hopes that eventually, yeah, okay, you grew off a magical space bunny uh, stool or turd, um, sitting down on a stool. It's permeating our language in various ways, so that a stool can support you. At Easter, there's the Easter bunny. Um, there are ways that this ultimate confrontation with the religious truth that the Earth was the shit of a space bunny. There and people are hoping it'll, as more and more elements are introduced subtly, then it will lead to a sociological acceptance of the concept. And of course, who will knowingly favor behaviors that constitute the genre of being called cruel and inhumane, and find them to be to their tastes, or they're absconding from the charges that they are due for instigating them, calling for them, thinking that they are called for or deserving, and then run off absconding accountability. There's an experience when you deconvert. Some claim to get it from ethics in religion. I couldn't find a reasoning in arguments for religion to accept it, because, and it's largely related back to the powers that a God has. I couldn't understand free will. Dan Barker is a former preacher who deconverted and talks about this topic a lot. If as soon as you enter the properties all-knowing and all-powerful, then our every thought, our every action was known to the God. He was powerful enough. He used his power and all his knowledge to create all of those moments, extending to our choices, our actions, everything. So saying he gave us the gift of free will is not even the beginnings of being plausible, unless he did so at the detriment, like he drew samples of his own capacity for knowledge and then meted it out into each of us, so that he knew that little bit less for the proportionate to what we were able to know. And then we would have free will, and God could say, I gave you this free will, but that woman ate an apple, so how dare she? Otherwise, God rigged the whole thing. He planted the tree. He knew if he'd planted the tree over here, then he would have averted The concept that it's incoherent, that we're being put to any sort of test or trial by a God with all knowledge and all power. Um, but yeah, the cruel behavior and endorsement of the behavior that is cruel and inhumane can't, I think, appeals to those who think, well, we are more than just human. We are only human for a temporary amount of time. We're going to be something better later in the next world. And I'm agnostic concerning the afterlife, or the idea of the afterlife. I think I don't know about it, and you don't know about it. But how many people are trying to make money from selling that they more or less possess copies of the policy, not only that their afterlife is true, but the terms and political rules for how to get from to point A as opposed to point B, and why weren't there more than just why weren't there more places than heaven versus hell? Because they thought the earth was flat and you could walk off the edge of it. So if they knew that we were on a globe, there probably wouldn't have just been heaven and hell. There would have been dozens of different locations. Um, but yeah, that's on one level of, as opposed to, that's on a level of explaining or addressing their principles. Why principle do you think that cruel and inhumane action, insert what the action was or actions were here? Why was it even conceivable? I honestly think deconverting um, and gaining an appreciation for the idea of living as if this is the only life we get would mean that if there is an afterlife, um, it would be a surprise to us, and we would find out at the time, and it gives a deeper appreciation for, well, holy shit, this is it, this is the only show. So I'll live as if there is nothing more other than this life, and this life becomes more special. Uh, and it's not a test. It's not a wind up to an eternity. Um, that's something that atheological writings do have to offer, um, and they only seem negative or disappointing, I think, if you are um, truly invested in uh, propitiations, making propitiations and sacrifices for the sake of heaven and the avoidance of hell. Einstein said man would indeed be in a poor way if his morals had to be motivated by a fear of punishment or hope for a reward after death. So I also think these afterlife agendas and environments distract a person from how and why they should comport themselves and their manners in certain ways now, in the here and now. Um, and while at the same time enabling people to see the benefits and the virtue in community and friendships and things like that, instead of diverting and shafting all um, well, there's no reward yet, but wait till you see when, and plus, is it what's worse, like sending somebody a death threat, or imparting to them that they deserve to burn and be tortured in a place called hell for all eternity? Is that equivalent to a death threat? Is it on par with the death threat? Is it not quite a death threat? Is it worse than a death threat? Um, it's sending them a death wish, I think. But yeah, it requires no conceptual awareness of ethical theory or ethical philosophy to just go, well, I am this way so I can get into heaven and not get into hell. Um, Also trace the substance of a criticism or an argument back to its source. Oh, he's offended by the question that the Queen issued, stating that there's no greater, or implying that there'd be no greater source of inspiration than the Bible. And then you give your reasons, and then they go, it's the stupidest bloke culture Aussie thing I don't like. They go, oh, well, he must want to be the new king of Australia. No, it's like, did I say I like the monarch? It's the same as them going, same sort of thinking as them going, well, if they don't acknowledge our God, they must be serving our devil. Track them and survey them and see if they make any satanic propitiations in the next 72 hours. So this Freemason church doesn't seem to have acknowledged the last 2 centuries of biblical scholarship, and it doesn't seem to have acknowledged the Age of Enlightenment. And that's exactly what modern atheistic critics of religious extremists have to say about Islamic terrorism. Is that, you know, they are acting off a metaphysic that has not paid any homage to a reformation, has not had a renaissance, hasn't comprehended terms like the suspension of judgment. And you think these people are even of sound mind to champion psych studies on people because they worked out, yeah, if we can boost output of psych meds, then we can spread our stores strategically around near as many general practitioners' offices as we can in the ACT. Like, you are not qualified to study a fucking thing. Worked for you for 9 years. How can you be so stupidly wrong? Like, how? How? I would say each and every one of us is on the sly, on the hush, encouraged by the Rights Act in its current form to think freedom is to be found by the affiliation or involvement in a religion. It's a moot point telling us that we're free to choose to be involved in a religion, because everybody knows that. You don't say, you know, you have the freedom to become a member of the AMF bowling club, or you have the freedom to choose between McDonald's, KFC, or Hungry Jack's for dinner. So why it's thought to be needed to be on our charter is marginalizing of the stance of unbelief. And it's not only is it marginalizing, it's marginalizing on the grounds of
You're doing great. I know how to crawl in a tube.
Since these fall under rights, then it's marginalized on the under a ground of ethical discrimination. Like you won't know ethics or understand an ethical way to live unless you are involved in a religion. It's the right thing for you to do to be in a religion. So ethical philosophy independent of religion, which is millennia old, is something that is implicitly discouraged by our rights statute, rights charter.
Oh boy, here I go killing again.
And so yeah, I also do think that the opposition to art, or the inclination to call art an evil influence, um, I don't resort to banal statements like "takes one to know one," but it comes from an approach, since they're opposing something defined as artificial, where I can empathize with an ambiguity. So, room for ambiguity is where they go, well, your art is clearly personal to you in some way.
Oh man, what have I done? Drop the gun.
But then that'll take time of,
I guess that makes
I guess, studying, character study, and
What are you doing, Morty? This is a
looking into
collective
what
federation
values a
outpost.
person's
I know I've
hold
tried to tell you my
person
entire
holds.
backstory, but Grandpa and government don't get along.
He saved my life.
What? Whoa, are you
The routine of
the
not
final
harming
target?
anybody, but then
What's your name?
expressing
My kind has no use for
what you hate
violence.
about
What you
life,
need
or
is what you call
expressing what's
justice.
wrong in art
No,
through your art
sympathy.
Oh, good job, Morty.
is
You killed my
more
best customer,
respectful
but you
of
still used a mind-reading
all
fart.
other
I
people.
like listening
Um,
to art. Morty, would you kindly release me by pulling that lever to the left of my cell? I'm in great
my
pain.
decision not to
Morty, don't do it.
it's I'm openly admitting to be a contestant of religions,
Get him out of here. He's gaseous. He's not gonna make it through the portal, Morty.
but
Well,
I've
I guess we're all
defended
getting in the car,
myself
right?
and other people's.
No,
I
just
could
get in the
have
car.
I could have done a better job
I wanna go back
with
to the
myself,
lizard
but
sheds. I don't wanna deal
the
with
right
this.
to
You've been clear on the
life,
fact that you don't wanna help,
movement,
so just go away.
More
expression, and
coming.
health.
Screw this. I'm out.
I defend. I'm a defender of those rights, but not religion. There's former church members who've deconverted who will talk about being petrified. How would you feel if you're taught that if someone wrongs you, it was your God's will, that your God intended your harm, in a punitive context? You were to be punished. He willed for you to be harmed. Now all of a sudden, the highest possible authority has implied to you that you've got no one to turn to reach out to, or to express your problems to, and that every single manner in which you've been wronged was a predetermined will of a deity. So of course they'll lash out at art because
No, in what you call the
they're more fake